There is trouble brewing in Ithaca, and it is not the suitors. It's not even the imminent arrival of the sea people. It is the SJWs, apparently, muddling one of the most foundational stories of Western civilization. Now step back for a moment, because that statement is flawed. Heavily flawed. Horrifically flawed. Some people see Christopher Nolan's casting and call it a sacrilege of skin color of Homer. Others see criticism of casting and call it simple racism. Both descriptions can contain pieces of the truth. Both are also wildly incomplete. Even if you have never read the Odyssey, and even if you do not give a damn what color Helen of Troy was, there is something important buried beneath this controversy. The argument reveals how we imagine the ancient world, who we allow to represent its ideals, and why a fictional woman from 3,000 years ago can still cause grown adults to lose their minds online. The Odyssey opened to broadly positive reviews. The New York Times called it a trippy, far-out blast. Even Rotten Tomatoes was beaming from critics and the common folk alike. Perhaps if Roger Ebert were still roaming the multiplexes, he would be amazed by the thoughtfulness buried inside Nolan's spectacle. But before the film had even arrived, a culture war had already begun. One very loudly South African billionaire complained about the lack of whiteness in the actresses playing Helen and Athena. Commentators across the right, especially from the Daily Wire, declared that the film had made ancient Greece too dark. There was even outrage that Elliot Page had supposedly been casted as Achilles. There was one major problem with that argument. Elliot Page does not even play Achilles. Achilles is not even in the movie. So it turns out that gender was not the film's Achilles' heel. Neither was race. Page plays Sinon and appears for only a few minutes. Zendaya and Lupita Nyong'o barely dominate the runtime either. And Travis Scott appears for roughly long enough to remind us that Christopher Nolan what straight up means. The outrage was never really about screen time. It was about symbolism. A black Helen, a black Athena, and a trans actor playing a Greek warrior distributed the image of an ancient world that many people assume was white, stable, masculine, and simple. That ancient world never existed. This is not to say that Homer secretly described Helen as a 21st century black woman. He did not. It is not to say that race was invisible in antiquity. It was not. And it is not even to say that every modern casting choice is automatically profound simply because it is diverse. The stronger argument is this. Homer does not give us the modern racial profiles that angry viewers pretend he does. The white classical world in our imagination is partly a later invention. Nolan's casting uses the freedom of postmodernist myth to redefine what beauty, wisdom, guilt, and courage can look like. To understand why, we have to begin with the woman for whom 1,000 ships were launched, and for whom 1,000 comment sections have now combusted. When we search through the annals of history, Helen of Troy is usually depicted as pale. Ancient pottery and Roman wall paintings establish the familiar outline. She is richly dressed, watched by warriors, desired by kings, and treated less like a person than the world's most destructive trophy. Centuries later, European painters made her even whiter and even more romantic. Dante Gabriel Rossetti gives her long golden hair that would make even Hitler blush. Evelyn de Morgan paints her holding a mirror, reflecting upon the calamity caused by her own gorgeosity. Gustave Moreau turns her into a porcelain apparition who stands almost emotionless before the bloodshed committed in her name. These paintings are beautiful, but some might call these paintings banal or derivative. But it's important to remember that these are interpretations. The problem began when the interpretation became confused with the original text. In the Odyssey, Homer does not pause the story to provide Helen's casting breakdown. He describes her through beauty, clothing, status, and divine comparison. When Helen enters the poem, Homer writes, "From her fragrant, high-roofed chamber came Helen, like Artemis of the golden arrows." Later she is called long-robed Helen, peerless among women. And in another passage she is described as fair-cheeked. There it is, fair-cheeked. Case closed. Christopher Nolan has been annihilated by a single adjective. Except, the word fair in English does not always mean pale. It can mean beautiful, pleasing, or noble. Even in the original Greek, it carried separate meanings. More importantly, Homeric epithets are not police sketches. They are compact phrases inherited through oral poetry. They signal beauty, grandeur, gender, status, or divine resemblance. They do not provide the measurements for a modern racial category, one that didn't even exist at the time. Helen is also described in Homeric poetry as white-armed. That sounds decisive until we examine what pale skin meant within archaic Greek art. Women are frequently represented as lighter than men. The difference could communicate class and labor. A pale elite woman was imagined as someone protected from outdoor work. A darker or bronzed man could embody warfare, athletics, travel, and physical prowess. This was a gendered beauty code. It was not the modern census category, quote-unquote, that is, Caucasian. Classicist Tim Whitmarsh has written that ancient Greeks would have staggered by the suggestion that they were simply white. This does not mean that ancient people failed to notice complexion. They noticed skin, geography, language, ancestry, and custom. They could be xenophobic, hierarchical, and even brutally prejudiced, but they did not organize the entire human race through the exact categories that modern Americans inherited. Even Homer's color language resists our certainty. This is the poet of the wine-dark sea. In one translation cited by Whitmarsh, Athena restores Odysseus to beauty, and he became black-skinned again, and the hairs became blue around his chin. I do not believe, and I don't think anyone should believe, that Christopher Nolan should have casted out a Smurf or someone from the Blue Man Group as Odysseus. The point is that Homeric color is not a paint catalog. The world of the poem is also larger than Greece. Helen possesses medicine associated with Egypt, which at the time was ruled by African Nubians, and they ruled for about 100 years or so. The gods travel to the Ethiopians. People from the edges of the Greek imagination appear throughout epic and history. Herodotus later described Ethiopians as the tallest and most beautiful of all men. Does that prove that Helen was Ethiopian? No, but it definitely shows that they had a reverence for the people. And this is where some defenses of the casting became as weak as the attacks. We do not need to invent a secret black Helen in order to defend a black actress. Homer does not give us enough as evidence to turn Helen into a modern racial profile in either direction. What Homer does establish is much more important. Helen is a supreme symbol of beauty. Her beauty reorganizes the political world around her. Men fight, die, lie, and destroy cities because of what she represents. Casting Lupita Nyong'o, who, without a doubt, is definitely a symbol of beauty, does not contradict that central fact. It embodies it. Nolan is saying that the mythical image of the most beautiful woman in the world can be carried by a black woman. That does not erase Homer. It interrupts the much newer assumption that universal beauty must, by definition, be white. Part of the casting backlash comes from a visual reflex. People hear ancient Greece and immediately picture white temples, white statues, white robes, and white people standing around discussing democracy. But the marble was not originally that white. Greek and Roman sculpture was often painted. Hair, clothing, armor, lips, eyes, and skin could be covered in vivid pigment. Gold leaf and gemstones were sometimes added. The ancient city was not a clean, monochrome museum. It was bright, crowded, theatrical, and occasionally gaudy. Over time, that paint faded. Other traces were buried beneath dirt or removed during aggressive cleaning. The surviving white surface was then mistaken for the artist's intention. Art historian Mark Abbey calls the belief that the ancients rejected bright color a lie we all hold dear. That lie shaped more than museum displays. Beginning in the Renaissance and intensifying in the 18th century, European thinkers treated white marble as a symbol of beauty, purity, restraint, and reason. Johann Winckelmann, one of the founders of modern art history, wrote that the whiter the body is, the more beautiful it is. The weathered remains of ancient art became evidence for an entire racial and aesthetic fantasy. Damage was transformed into philosophy. Polychromy does not prove that every ancient Greek had dark skin. Far from it. A painted statue is not a consensus record, but it does prove that the classical world in our imagination has already been color corrected. The correction simply removed the color. Marco Leona of the Metropolitan Museum called ancient polychromy the best-kept secret that's not even a secret. Another scholar compared seeing only white marble to finding a whale skeleton on the beach and claiming that you had seen the whole animal. That is what many people do with antiquity. They see the skeleton and mistake it for the living world. The Mediterranean was a network. Greeks traded, migrated, colonized, fought, enslaved, and intermarried across Egypt, North Africa, Anatolia, the Levant, Italy, and beyond. The ancient world was not racially harmonious. It was not secretly progressive. It contained slavery, conquest, and deep contempt for foreigners. But it was not a sealed white country club either. So when Nolan fills his film with visibly different people, he is not necessarily modeling a perfectly homogeneous past. He is rejecting the false cleanliness through which past has often been remembered. The white marble image looks traditional only because we have repeated it for centuries. Zendaya's Athena requires even less historical defense. Athena is a goddess. She changes form. She disguises herself as different mortals. She moves between human and divine bodies whenever the story requires it. Whining that a shape-shifting deity has been played by the wrong race requires an almost heroic resistance to the concept of shape-shifting. But Nolan's decision is more technically permissible. It is thematically purposeful. Spoilers begin here, for all those worried about that. In the film, Athena is not merely a divine guide who appears whenever Odysseus has taken another catastrophically masculine wrong turn. She becomes the face of his own guilt. During the fall of Troy, Odysseus watches violence spread beyond soldiers and into the civilian world. A young woman is taken. She is brutalized while he fails to intervene. The film cuts between her suffering and an image of Athena until the mortal woman and the goddess become fused inside Odysseus' memory. From that point onward, Athena is not only wisdom whispering into his ear, she is the memory of what his wisdom has done. This is essential to Nolan's interpretation of Odysseus. He is ingenious, charismatic, resilient, and brave. He is also a liar whose brilliance repeatedly turns other people into instruments. The Trojan horse is the greatest tactical victory of his life. It is also the original lie that follows him home. Zendaya's Athena embodies that contradiction. She is divine guidance and moral accusation at the same time. Her face becomes the face Odysseus cannot escape. The casting is therefore not asking whether an ancient Greek would have used our racial terminology for Athena. It is asking who can embody the god who guides this man, judges this man, and reminds him that intelligence without conscience becomes cruelty. That is not deviation from the myth. That is an interpretation of it. Finally, we arrive at Elliot Page, who, once again, does not play Achilles. Page plays Sinon, a Greek figure most familiar from Virgil's Aeneid rather than Homer's Odyssey. Nolan uses Sinon in the Trojan War prologue. He helps persuade the Trojans that the wooden horse is a sacred offering. But in this version, Sinon does not fully understand the massacre hidden inside the deception. He is used as the Trojans are used. When Sinon later confronts Odysseus in the underworld, the victory loses its heroic polish. Odysseus argues that the lie ended the war. Sinon answers that this justification gives no comfort to the dead. Nolan described the purpose of the character clearly. Sinon allows the film to put a place on the tragedy of war. That face belongs to Elliot Page, and this is why the casting matters. Sinon represents courage without domination. He is vulnerable, sincere, and ultimately furious that his trust was converted into a weapon. Casting a trans man in that role expands the image of courage without changing what the character does. The film does not stop so that a studio executive can walk on screen and explain representation to us. Page is simply permitted to embody bravery, betrayal, anger, and grief. That simplicity is what unsettles some viewers. Marginalized actors are often accepted as symbols of suffering so long as they remain outside the ideals of the story. Nolan places them directly inside those ideals. Helen is beauty. Athena is wisdom and judgment. Sinon is courage and consciousness. None of these concepts become smaller because a different body carries it. The Odyssey is not a documentary. It is not security footage recovered from the Bronze Age. It is a myth. It has been sung, rewritten, translated, illustrated, Christianized, romanticized, filmed, and transformed for thousands of years. Every generation has cast the ancient world through the concerns of its own age. The supposedly traditional white Helen is also an adaptation. She was shaped by European painting, neoclassical sculpture, museum display, and the modern racial imagination. Nolan's version simply makes its interpretation visible. By casting a black woman as Helen, he says that the symbol of supreme beauty does not belong exclusively to whiteness. By casting Zendaya as Athena, he makes divine wisdom inseparable from the guilt that follows Odysseus home. By casting Elliot Page as Sinon, he allows a trans man to embody courage, not as a political footnote, but as a tragic moral center. This is not to say that every criticism of the movie is malicious. It is possible to dislike a performance. It is possible to question a creative choice. It is even possible to prefer an adaptation that follows a particular visual tradition. But historical accuracy cannot become a magic phrase that ends the discussion. The Odyssey is not a history book. Its characters do not possess modern racial paperwork, and the supposedly accurate image being defended is often the product of later centuries. The people furious about the casting claim that they are protecting Homer from modern politics. Often, they are protecting a much more modern fantasy, a uniformly white antiquity, an uncomplicated masculinity, and a classic tradition that belongs only to the faces preserved in 19th century paintings and weathered marble. The irony is that Nolan is not destroying the classical tradition. He is actively participating in it. Myths survive because each generation can see itself inside them. They survive because the same story can reveal different truths when it passes through different voices, different bodies, and different ages. So no, you shouldn't care that Helen is played by a black woman, Athena by Zendaya, or Sinon by transgender Elliot Page. You should care whether these actors reveal something true about beauty, guilt, courage, conscience, and the catastrophic ingenuity of Odysseus. That is fidelity to fable, not reproducing the same complexion forever, but returning to the same human questions. And if diverse casting still ruins the Odyssey for you, do not worry. Odysseus has survived gods, monsters, storms, shipwrecks, and 10 years of wandering. I believe he can survive this.